think. I'm waiting it out. Okay, I think we're live. I was about to say good morning, and it's not good morning. It is good afternoon. I'm actually in here in the time that I would like to do this, which is to get this started between 3:30 and 4. And yay, it's 10 minutes to 4. So yay, I should be off before David's scheduled time. Whether or not he does it, that's between him and, the keeper of time. So, but what I am here to do, because it is Saturday afternoon, and I reserve Saturday afternoon for reading other books. In this case, we are reading the Bible again for the first time by Marcus Borg. It is honestly, it is one of my favorite books. It is one of my favorite books. Because he comes at it from true biblical scholarship, but also from love. He definitely loves the Bible. And you can see it in the way that he critiques it, in the way that he reads it, and the way he mourns what people have done with the Bible. So I appreciate all of that. So it is definitely one of my favorite books. And it, not coincidentally, is the text that Jesse uses to teach his Bible wisdom class, which he started last Monday. And if you're seeing this anytime between now and February today's the 21st, so the 23rd, you can still join the class after tonight, after the class on Monday, which is the 23rd of February, 2026, if I need to say that. The class closes. But it's a really, really, really good class. Because again, as I said, because you can tell that Marcus loves the Bible, Jesse does too. And Jesse loves wisdom, which is why he titled the class Bible Wisdom. It's a really good class. So I do highly commend it, and I happen to be in the class, so you can interact with me. So we are doing chapter 4 in this book, and what that means is that we've moved on into part 2. The first part was about the reading lenses through which we read the Bible, because our culture influences it, our religion influences all of that. The way we were raised influences the way we read the Bible. And so we've moved on to part 2, so we are going to do the Hebrew Bible. Now, and I appreciate, because he said it in class on Friday night, I don't call it the Old Testament and the New Testament because I think that's very disrespectful. And I learned that from Reverend Norm. I call it the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament. Okay? That is more respectful for what it is. Because the Hebrews, the Jewish faith still uses the Hebrew Bible. It's not old to them. And they keep it updated and moving with the modern times, which is also really important. And it is one of the problems that the Christian Testament does have, because people tried to freeze it, and it's got to be a living, breathing document. And if it's not a living, breathing document, then we're stuck looking at the finger instead of at the moon the finger's pointing to. All right, so let's move on into chapter 2. Part 2, the Hebrew Bible, chapter 4, reading the creation stories again. And give me just a moment while I find out where the notes are. Because, oh, wow. I'm going to interrupt myself a lot. There are a lot of notes in this one. Okay, so most of the time I think it's important to go ahead and read the notes in place. Because I would do it if I was just reading the book anyway. I would flip and look at the notes. So that's what I do as I read these books. So you don't have to wait to the end for the notes. Occasionally I do skip over a note because I just don't notice it, but for the most part, I will go ahead and do the notes in the reading. So, chapter 4, reading the creation stories again. We begin with the Hebrew Bible, commonly known among Christians as the Old Testament. And there's our first note. The Hebrew Bible and the Protestant Old Testament are identical in content, though divided differently. In the former, there are 24 books. In the latter, there are 39 books. The Catholic Old Testament includes another 12 books, commonly called the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanonical books. Orthodox Christians, often called Eastern Orthodox, include another 4. Which tells you right now that even the major branches don't agree on all of the books in the Bible, which is one of the reasons why my favorite Bible is a student Bible. Oh, I should have brought it with me. A student Bible that includes every book that anybody uses and has a list in the front that tells you who uses what books. So, okay. As in most recent scholarship, I will use the term Hebrew Bible instead of Old Testament for 2 reasons. The first is respect for Judaism. For Jews, the Hebrew Bible is the Bible, not the Old Testament. The second reason pertains to Christians. For many Christian readers, the adjective old implies outdated or outmoded or superseded, as if the New Testament were intended to replace the Old Testament. Lost my place. Hold on. Commonly accompanying this usage is the notion that the Old Testament speaks of a God of law and judgment, whereas the New Testament speaks of a God of grace and love. Though this stereotype is widespread among Christians, it is simply wrong. Both visions of God appear in both Testaments. The notion that the New Testament and its God replaces the Old Testament and its God was rejected by early Christianity in the 2nd century. Note 2. This rejection came about in what was known as the Marcionite controversy. Marcion was a 2nd century Roman Christian who rejected the Hebrew Bible as unchristian and affirmed a very abbreviated portion of what later became the New Testament. Oh, I may have to look into that. That sounds interesting. Okay. And it was in the 4th century, which I'm sure he's probably going to tell us, that the Bible was set into the form that most Christians use it now. And that's the Nicene Council. So, which I'm sure he's going to get to, so let me not jump ahead. Okay, let's go back. Despite a continuing Christian tendency to relegate the Old Testament to 2nd place, it is for Christians just as much Bible, just as sacred scripture, as is the New Testament. When Christians do not see this, we not only reject much of our heritage, but impoverish our understanding of Jesus, the New Testament, and Christianity itself. Within the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew Bible has 3 main divisions. In English, they are called the Law, the Prophet, and the Writing. In Hebrew, they are respectively Torah, Niven, and Kethavim. Ooh, I wish I had somebody to pronounce that for me because I know I just did a terrible job. No disrespect. My apologies. I do not speak Hebrew. The first letters of each of the Hebrew terms form the acronym Tanakh, a common Jewish term for the Hebrew Bible as a whole. The Torah is the first and foundational division of the Hebrew Bible. It consists of 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Though the books themselves do not say anything about their authorship, both the Jewish and Christian traditions have attributed them to Moses. Thus, they are sometimes spoken of as the 5 books of Moses. And though the most common English designation for this book is the law, the Torah contains much more than what is commonly meant by the word law. The word Torah itself means more. It can be translated as instruction or teaching. That's interesting. The Torah does indeed include the laws of Israel, but it also contains the stories of her origins. It is the instruction and teaching about the people's story and identity, as well as the foundation of their laws. In other words, it combines narrative and legal traditions. The Torah is also commonly called the Pentateuch, as we saw earlier, a Greek word meaning the 5 scrolls. In fact, this is probably the most commonly used term for these 5 books. The Pentateuch begins with Israel's stories of creation, to which we now turn. Israel's stories of the world's beginnings. Ooh. We're about to have some bullet points. Ancient Israel stories of the world's beginnings in the first 11 chapters of Genesis are among the best known parts of the Bible. Almost everybody in Western culture has heard them. And so I said bullet points. There they are. The creation of the world in 6 days. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Their temptation by a talking serpent and their expulsion from Eden. Their sons, Cain and Abel, and Cain's murder of Abel. The great ages of the elderly people, with Methuselah topping the list at 969 years. The giants born from the sexual union of the sons of God with the daughters of men. Noah's Ark. Yeah. Okay. Noah's Ark and the Great Flood. The building of the Tower of Babel and its destruction by God, and the fragmentation of humankind into different language groups. And before I go on, I follow a reverend named Benjamin Kremer, Cremer, and he posted a piece. I think it was last night, but it could have been this morning. Honestly, the days kind of bleed together sometimes. Talking about the word Adam. And in the Genesis stories, Adam is used both as a name and as a category. I think he said in Hebrew, Adam actually means humanity. It doesn't mean male. And when I read that right there changes the way you read the creation stories. And I just thought that was fascinating. To know that when when they were telling these stories, they were not using Adam to mean a male. They were using Adam to mean humanity. Ugh. Dang. Translations. It'll get you every time. Okay, we're done with the bullet points. Major battles about the factual truth of these stories have marked Western culture in the modern period. Prior to the birth of modernity, that word just, in the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. However, so prior to the birth of modernity in the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, however, the factual truth of Genesis was accepted in the Jewish and Christian worlds without controversy, even though its stories were not always read literally. Note 3. See quotations from the 3rd century Christian theologian Origen later in this chapter. He did talk about that in previous, the difference between literally and factually. Something can be true. Yeah. He's talked about it before. So, okay. There was little or no reason to question their factuality. Theology and science alike took it for granted that the universe was relatively young and that the earth and its continents, mountains, oceans, and varieties of life were created in very much the same form in which we now find them. Common estimates of the time of creation ranged from 6000 BCE to 4000 BCE. Around 1650, the age of the earth was calculated with great precision by an Anglican archbishop of Dublin named James Ussher. That's Ussher, if you would like to look him up. And I find it interesting that it was an archbishop, an Anglican archbishop that did it. Okay. Oh, yeah. No. Okay. Here. Using the geologies in Genesis, Ussher concluded that the creation occurred in the year 404 BCE. Note 4. The date he calculated still appears in the margins of some Bibles. His calculation was made just in time to collide with the birth of modern science. Geology and paleontology soon began to point to an immeasurably older Earth. The challenge to the factual reading of the Genesis stories of creation was intensified by Charles Darwin's argument for evolution in On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. Suddenly, the issue was not simply the age of the Earth, but the development of present life forms from much earlier life forms through natural processes. The 19th century was a time of intense conflict between science and the Bible. And honestly, I'm not sure it's slowed down now, but, hey, that's just me. Some intellectuals and village atheists delighted in using science to debunk the Bible and Christianity. Among Christians, some adjusted quickly to the new scientific claims and integrated them into a non-literal reading of Genesis. Note 5. See George M. Marsden, Fundamentalism and American Culture, 1980, pages 17 to 26, or Ian G. Barbour, Issues in Science and Religion, from 1966, 96 through 104, and Religion and Science, from 1997, pages 49 through 74. Okay. Others felt that the truth of the Bible and Christianity were under attack. The controversy continues to this day, though it involves a much smaller number of Christians. Maybe a smaller number, but they're definitely loud. And honestly, it's one of the things that I've seen in politics lately, where if somebody says something that they don't like, then they immediately scream, "Oh, you're attacking the Bible." And we're like, and the other party's like, "We didn't say anything about the Bible. What are you talking about?" So, that's what I'm saying. It may be a smaller number, but they've gotten louder. Okay, back to the reading. Advocates of scientific creationism still defend the factual accuracy of six-day creation story. Note 6. For an analysis and critique of scientific creationism or creation science, see Conrad Hayer's The Meaning of Creation, Genesis and Modern Science, from 1984. His book as a whole is an excellent study of the creation stories integrating modern biblical scholarship, science, and myth. Which may be worth looking into for me because, interesting. Okay. Expeditions are launched every few years to Mount Ararat in Turkey in search of the remains of Noah's Ark. Some still think of the Garden of Eden as a real place and seek to figure out its geographical location. Most often it is pinpointed somewhere in the Middle East, though I recall seeing a pamphlet arguing that it is in Wisconsin. Wisconsin? Okay. But contemporary biblical scholarship does not read these stories as historically factual accounts of the world's beginnings. Instead, it sees them as ancient Israel stories of the world's beginnings and interprets them as profoundly true mythological stories. In this chapter, I will describe these stories as seen through the lens of contemporary scholarship. More specifically, I will offer a historical-metaphorical reading focusing primarily on the creation stories in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. First, though, I will describe them how I heard these creation stories for the first time. Okay, before I do that, one of the things that I want to tell you is that the way that I've heard Jesse describe these, and I'm quite sure he will describe them in class, is their grandparent stories. Their grandparent stories. When a grandchild comes to a grandparent and says, hey, how does this happen? And the grandparents are like, well, and they make up a story. It's not that it's not true. It's just that it's not factual. That's what we're talking about here. And if you've read Genesis, which I have multiple times, there are 2 creation stories. Just throwing that out there. Okay, so let's hear how Ernest heard these stories for the first time, because that's literally the title. Hearing the creation stories for the first time. As a child growing up in the church, I heard the stories in Genesis in a state of pre-critical naivety. Thus heard them as true stories. Note 7. For a discussion on pre-critical naivety, see chapter 3. Though I cannot recall a time when I took the 6 days of creation literally, I am sure I did so in very early childhood, and I would have done so without effort, even as I apparently let go of hearing them literally without conflict. When I learned about dinosaurs and the immense age and size of the universe in elementary school, I did not experience a religious crisis. I didn't either. But as I think back on those years, I realize that I continued to take Adam and Eve quite literally as the first 2 human beings, and that letting go of them was more of an issue. In elementary school, I learned about the early hominids with names like Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, and Peking. We now have note 8. And of course, we now know of humanoids much older than these that I have heard of when I was a child. Yeah, the Denisovians and Australopithecian. It just, yeah. Our family tree is very big. Very big. Okay, but it was not until my teenage years that I was struck by the implications of the evidence of such creatures. When I entered the stage of critical thinking, I began to wonder if I was supposed to identify the earliest of these as with Adam and Eve. But I thought of these early humanoids as hulking brutes, probably barely capable of language. They did not seem likely candidates for Adam and Eve, whose sons, Cain and Abel, engaged in complex tasks of farming and herding. And Cain had even built a city. Dante! So I began to take seriously the likelihood that Adam and Eve had not been real people. But if that likelihood turned out to be true, then what were we to make of the story of the first sin, commonly called the fall? In the Garden of Eden. If the fall was not historical, how, I wondered, would this affect the Christian story of universal sin, our need for redemption, and Jesus' death as the necessary sacrifice? Okay. I mean, I had the same question, so I get it. Something more seemed to be at stake in the historical factuality of Adam and Eve and the fall than was involved in the lengthening of the 6 days of creation to geographical epochs. Resolving these questions was a major theological problem for me. As I wrestled with it, the foundations of my religious understandings began to shake. If the story of Adam and Eve was not true, as a modern teenager, I thought of truth as that which was factual. What happened to the truth of the Bible and Christianity as a whole? I now see these chapters quite differently, reading them through the lens of historical scholarship and with sensitivity to their meaning as metaphorical narratives has enabled me once again to see them as profoundly true stories. And because their purpose is not to provide a factually accurate account of the world's beginning, it is beside the point to argue whether or not they are accurate or mistaken factual accounts. They are not God's stories of the world's beginnings. Rather, they are ancient Israel's stories of the world's beginnings. As we look at these stories now, we will ask two key questions. Why did ancient Israel tell these stories, and why did they tell them in this way? A historical, metaphorical approach provides illuminating answers to both. So let's start with historical illumination, because that's the next section. The first 11 chapters of Genesis need to be understood not only as the introduction to the Pentateuch, but also in the context of the Pentateuch as a whole. They are ancient Israel's stories of her prehistory. By that I mean two things. First, they are Israel's account of humankind in the time before her own particular history. A history whose telling begins with the stories of Abraham and Sarah, the father and mother of Israel. Abraham and Sarah are then the first two historical figures in the Bible. Note 9. To speak of them as historical figures does not imply that the stories about them are straightforward historical reports, or even that we have any accurate historical information about them. Rather, it means that Israel located the story of Abraham and Sarah in a recognizable historical context. Their names appear in a genealogy at the end of Genesis 11, and the story of their call to be the ancestors of Israel begins in Genesis 12. Everything before them is Israel's prehistory and functions as a prologue to the Pentateuch and Israel's story of her own creation. Second, to call these early chapters of Genesis prehistory means they are not to be read as historical accounts. Rather, as Israel's stories about the remote beginnings before there was an Israel. They are to be read as a particular kind of metaphorical narrative, namely as myths, about which I will soon say more. For now, I simply note that while myths are not literally true, they can nonetheless be profoundly true, rich in powerfully persuasive meanings. There is one further point before we turn to the stories themselves, namely, though we typically begin reading the Bible with the first chapters of Genesis, they are not where ancient Israel first begins telling her story. The creation stories were written relatively late. Israel as a people came into existence with the Exodus from Egypt in the 13th century BCE. At the earliest, Israel told a story of creation some 300 years later. As we shall see in the next chapter, the story of the Exodus, the covenant and the gift of the promised land is Israel's primal narrative and foundational story. In short, Israel told the story of the Exodus and God's creation of her as a people long before she told the story of God's creation of the world. And that should be really important to know. Okay, 2 stories of creation. The first 3 chapters of Genesis contain 2 stories of creation, written about 400 years apart. The first one, Genesis 1.1 through 2.3, was probably written in the 500 BCEs, or 500s BCE, commonly called the priestly or P story. It is part of a larger block of material extending through the Pentateuch and reflecting priestly and ritual concerns. The second one was written earlier. It begins in Genesis 2.5 and continues through the end of chapter 3. Perhaps written in the 900s BCE, it is commonly called the Yahwist or J creation stories because the author uses Yahweh as the name of God. All right, we've got note 10. Let me explain. J is the common abbreviation for Yahwist, the Yahwist source of Pentateuch. The source theory of the Pentateuch originated in German biblical scholarship in the 19th century. The German language does not have the letter Y. Which does not have the letter Y, uses the letter J for the sound made by the English Y. Thus, in German, the name of God, Yahweh, and the abbreviation is J. But it is conventional in English to spell Yahweh as Yahweh, instead a Y instead of a J. Hence, the odd result of the Yahweh source is the J source. Okay, that's good to know. I'm learning all kinds of things, and I've read this book 3 or 4 times. I just forget that. And I also want you to remember, he's saying written down. That doesn't mean that the stories weren't earlier. It was an oral tradition for a very long time until they needed to write it down. Okay? So these were all oral stories that were passed down. So these stories could be older than when they were written down. That's very important to know. Okay? All right. And back to the Yahwehist story is also part of a larger narrative account of Israel's origin, which extends throughout much of the Pentateuch. Note 11. Oh, and this is a very long note, so hold on. Well, hold on to your hats. In this section, I accept what has been the common scholarly understanding of the sources of the Pentateuch for over a century. Recently, that understanding has come under review and revision by some Hebrew biblical scholars. Though P and its dating in the 500s are still widely accepted, there are serious questions about whether J should be thought of as an early connected narrative or as a mixture of traditions from many periods of Israel's history, in which some of it is as late as in date as P. For a summary of the case made by several scholars regarding much of J as late, see Joseph Blenkinsop, The Pentateuch from 1992. Some recent scholars continue to see J as early. See, for example, Terence Fretheim's commentary on Genesis in the New Interpreter's Bible from 1994, specifically Volume 1, page 319 through 674. Harold Bloom and David Rosenberg's The Book of J from 1990 is based on an early date for J and somewhat provocatively and eccentrically argues that the author was likely a woman. If the debate among the Hebrew scholars concludes with a later date for J, my analysis would not be affected in any significant way for my comments on J do not depend on an early date. Okay. And the next two notes just are Genesis chapters, so I'll probably, knowing me, I'm going to tell you them anyway. All right, the P story. The P story, and the Bible as a whole, begins with the earth as a formless void. In the primeval darkness, the wind, or spirit, of God moves upon the primordial waters. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Oh. And that is Genesis 1.12. So the first two lines. Then God created the universe in 6 days. In a literary structure repeated for each day of creation, the story begins with the creation of light. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness God called night. And then there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Genesis 1.3 through 5. In rapid succession, the rest of the universe is created. On day 2, God creates the dome of the sky, the firmament, separating the primordial waters above the sky from those below. On day 3, God creates dry land, the seas and vegetation. On day 4, the lights are placed in the dome of the sky, sun, moon, and stars. We're on note 14. The sequence of the creative act points to the impossibility of reconciling the Genesis stories of creation with modern scientific knowledge simply by extending the time frame from days to geological epochs. Note that the light is created on the first day, yet the sun and the moon and the stars are not created until the 4th day. Indeed, the creation of vegetation, day 3, precedes the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. I never noticed that. On day 5, God creates sea life and birds. Finally, on day 6, God creates land creatures, concluding with the simultaneous creation of man and woman. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." So God created humankind in its image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. That's note 15. Genesis 1.26 through 27. The use of the plural pronouns us and our has often puzzled people. Who is God talking to? Though Christians have sometimes seen this as a reference to the Trinity, that is impossible in an ancient Hebrew story, roughly 1,000 years earlier than the notion of the Trinity. Most scholars think that the passage makes use of the image of God as a king surrounded by a heavenly council, such as we find, for example, in 1 Kings 22:19 through 23. There is an interesting correlation between what God creates on each of the first 3 days and what God creates on each of the second 3 days. A domain is created, then populated. Day 1, light. Day 4, sun, moon, and stars. Day 2, waters and sky. Day 5, sea life and birds. Day 3, dry land. Day 6, land creatures. Then we are told on the 7th day, God rests, thereby blessing and hallowing that day as the Sabbath. Okay, now we're going to do the J story. The J creation story begins in Genesis 2:4. It focuses on the creation of humankind and barely treats the creation of the world. It does not mention the creation of light or firmament or sun, moon, and stars or sea creatures. Rather, it begins with the creation of humankind, or of Adam, A-D-H-A-M, by the way. A Hebrew word meaning humankind. See, that's what I was talking about when I was mentioning what Benjamin Kremer, because never mind. I'm not even going to go there. You can ask me about it some other time. A Hebrew word meaning humankind and often translated as man. The creation of Adam is the climax of a very long sentence with which the story begins. Oh, we are about to do the run-on sentence. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not yet caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground. But a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed Adam from the dust of the ground and breathed into their nostrils the breath of life, and Adam became a living being. 16. Note 16. Genesis 2, 4-7. Note, whenever the word Lord appears in all capital letters, as it does here, it is a translation of Yahweh, the Hebrew sacred name for God. Oh. So anytime I said where you heard Lord, I could have said Yahweh. Interesting. Okay. The P story portrays humankind as the climax of creation by having people created last, after everything else. The J story gives humankind priority by having people created first, before vegetation and animals. In the P story, humans as male and female are created simultaneously. In J, the creation of woman comes later. To provide Adam with a place to live, God plants the Garden of Eden and gives Adam permission to eat all of its trees except one. You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but for the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For on the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And of course, that's note 17. Which is Genesis 2:17. So the next couple of notes are just telling you where in Genesis he's getting this stuff. All right. Then God creates companions for Adam. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that Adam should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner." God creates every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brings them to Adam, but none of them meets the need. There was not found a helper fit for Adam. So God puts Adam to sleep and forms woman out of one of his ribs. No longer alone, Adam exclaims, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Okay, which is 2:18-23. So that article that I was telling you about from Ben Kremer, what he said is the word that we translate as rib actually in Hebrew translates as half. So Adam was split in half. So he wasn't taken from a rib. Adam was cut in half. So the female already existed in the male and God just separated them. That's his contention. I don't think that Marcus contends that, but frankly, I like that story better. I also heard that story in Greek mythology watching Xena Warrior Princess. But that's a story for another day. That's why we spend a whole lot of time looking for our other half. We are looking for the part that we were separated from. But that can get into soulmates, and that can get really weird really fast. So, as I said, story for another time. Into this paradise comes a talking snake. The serpent tempts the primeval couple to eat from the forbidden tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He promises them that if they do, they will be like God, knowing good and evil. They accept the serpent's invitation, and their lives change dramatically. Now, aware of their nakedness, they make loincloths out of fig leaves. Of more serious consequence, they are afraid and hide themselves from God. Punishment follows. The woman, now named Eve, is sentenced to pain in childbearing and subjugation to her husband. The man, now named Adam, is sentenced to the toil and sweat of raising food from an earth filled with thorns and thistles. Both are exiled from the Garden of Eden. The story concludes with Adam and Eve living east of Eden, the garden entrance guarded by an angel with flaming sword. Life in paradise is over. And that is Genesis 3:1 through 24. To return to our two key questions, why did the people of ancient Israel tell these stories, and why did they tell them this way? One answer sometimes given is that these stories functioned as primitive science. Surprise! Ancient Israel did not know how the world came into existence, so she created these stories in order to explain how things came to be. But there is much more going on here than a pre-scientific explanation of origins. To state my central claim in advance, Israel told these stories to express her deepest convictions about God and the world, and about what is often called human nature. That is, what we are like and what our lives east of Eden are like. Before treating more fully the first of these key questions, I begin with the second question. Why did ancient Israel tell these stories this way? All right, hang on. I'm going to grab myself a drink of water here. Oh, Lord. Reading the peace story again through a historical lens. Historical study helps us to understand why ancient Israel told these stories in the way she did. As already noted, the peace story was most likely written around the 500s BCE. To connect this to ancient Israel's history, the Jewish people went into exile in Babylon after the Babylonian Empire conquered their homeland and destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE. The exile lasted almost 50 years until 539 BCE, when a small number of Jews returned to Jerusalem in ruins and began the task of rebuilding a Jewish homeland under the dominance of a new imperial power, Persia. Thus, the peace story of creation was written during or shortly after that exile. The 6-day creation. Because Jews were sharply reduced in numbers during this period in history, distinctive practices as a means of sustaining their identity as a people became vitally important. Among these practices was the observance of the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, as a day of rest. Though Sabbath observance predated the exile, it became even more important during and after the exile. So why does creation take 6 days in the peace story? To make the point that even God observed the Sabbath. Rather than being intended as a literal account of how long creation took, the 6-day creation story was meant to reinforce the importance of the Sabbath. And here, just from an anthropological standpoint, which I don't remember if he gets to or not, so we'll if he does, then good on me. And if not, here's some additional information for you. These people went into exile in a foreign country. how do you maintain your cultural identity in a foreign country? By telling stories. That is how you do it. By telling stories, keeping your language, keeping your tradition, that is how you keep your traditions. And if you want to go back and look at the slave trade, for instance, one of the reasons why they ripped families apart and banned them from telling stories and banned them from keeping their languages was exactly that, to destroy their communities so that they had no identity. So that is what one of the points that Borg is making, whether he actually makes the point or not, is that telling these stories is how the Jewish community maintained its identity in exile, and how, when they returned to their homeland, it helped bolster them in their ability to rebuild their homeland, especially knowing that they were rebuilding their homeland under another power, which is the Kingdom of Persia. Okay? Stories are important for knitting community together. That is the major, point of storytelling, whether the stories are factually true or just true. Okay? And if you haven't figured that out now, then you need to go read Joseph Campbell, because that's one of Joseph Campbell's major points. All right, so the ancient cosmology. The word cosmology refers to one's image or map of the cosmos or universe. In common with Babylonian and other Middle Eastern cosmologies, the ancient Israelites thought of the earth as the center of the universe. Above the earth was the dome of the sky, called the firmament in many English translations. This understanding is reflected in the P story. On the second day of creation, God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God called the dome sky. On the fourth day, God created the sun, moon, and stars, and set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth. Okay, we are now on note 20. Genesis 1:6, and then 1:6, and then 14 and 17, or 14 through 17. What seemed like a strange notion to us today actually coincides well with human experience. The sky looks like a dome over our heads. On it are mounted the sun, moon, and stars, and it rotates around us. Moreover, the notion that there is water above the dome of the sky also reflects experience. Water comes from the sky as rain and snow. Thus, as the flood begins in the time of Noah, we are told the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the firmament were opened. Which is Genesis chapter 7, line 11. Far from providing us with an understanding of the universe that can be reconciled with modern or postmodern science, the cosmology of the creation story simply reflects the way ancient Israel thought things were. Israel told the story this way because she thought of the universe this way. Thus, it is Israel's story of creation, not God's story of creation. The literary form of the P story. The P story of creation was likely adapted from an ancient Israelite liturgy or hymn of praise to God. Its use of repeating phrases suggests refrains such as are found in hymns and liturgies. Each of the following is repeated 7 times. God said, "Let there be," and it was so, and God saw that it was good. That would make sense. One of the best ways to remember things is to make them, to set them to music. Like, you have no idea how many song lyrics rattle around in my head all the time. What's the matter, Dante? Come here. There was evening and there was morning is repeated after each day of creation. Moreover, the 6 days of creation suggest 6 stanzas. If a liturgy does lie behind the first chapter of Genesis, we should imagine it being sung or canted, or perhaps antiphonally with a cantor and one or more choirs. The recognition that the P story is likely to have been a hymn or liturgy has an immediate implication. We do not expect hymns to provide accurate factual information. Okay. When Christians sing the hymn, Jesus shall reign where the sun does its successive journeys run, we are not saying that we believe the sun goes round the earth. The language of the hymns is the language of poetry, metaphor, and praise. Creation cannot be described, but it can be sung. Note 22. For other hymns of creation in the Hebrew Bible, see PS 8 and PS 104. Okay. Indeed, Genesis 1 has been described as a doxology. The roots of that word mean words of or about glory. A doxology is a hymn of praise. As the most familiar English doxology reminds us, praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise God, all creatures here below. Thus, the book of Genesis and the Bible as a whole begin with a hymn of praise to God as creator. It is difficult to imagine a more appropriate beginning. Whew. This is a long chapter. The proclamation of Israel's God as creator. The origin of the peace story in the time after the Babylonian conquest adds one more dimension of meaning. In antiquity, when a nation was decisively conquered by another nation, it was commonly thought that the god or gods of the victorious nation had defeated the god of the vanquished nation, exposing that god as inferior or perhaps as no god at all. To many, Babylonians and Jews alike, it looked during the exile as if the gods of imperial Babylon had triumphed over the God of Israel. In this setting, the opening line and central claim of the P creation story defiantly assert that the God of Israel is the creator of heaven and earth, of all that is. It proclaims the lordship of Israel's God over the lordship of Babylon and its gods. The story affirms a counter world, an alternative world to the world of empire. Note 23. Walter Brueggemann, Genesis, page 24 through 27. His exposition on Gen 1 through 3 is filled with brilliant insights. Okay. This affirmation is, as we shall see, a theme that runs throughout the Bible from beginning to end. Okay. So, what I just heard him say was that if in the ancient times, if one nation defeated the other nation, then the gods of the victorious nation defeated the gods of the other nation, or exposed them not to be gods of all. So what the Jewish story is doing is saying, okay, you know what? You can have that story all you want, but here's what we're going to say. Our God created everything. Therefore, our God is better than your God. Our God is the actual God, and your gods are just pretenders. So that's why he's calling it a counter world. All right. Whoa. Marcus Borg is making me work for it today, but I appreciate the work. I really do. Reading the J story through a historical lens. Just as the P story is illuminated by setting it in its historical context, so also is the J story of creation, the symbolic meaning of names. The author of the J story uses names in such a way as to suggest that they are symbolic. Adam is not a proper name in ancient Hebrew. So no other person in the Bible is named Adam. Rather, Adam is the Hebrew Adham, which, as already noted, is a common noun meaning humankind. Indeed, the term involves a play on the word. Adham comes from the Hebrew word Adhamah, which means ground or dust. In other words, the first human is a dust creature. We are made of dust, made from the earth. Moreover, because this word means humankind, its use suggests that the author is thinking not of a specific human, but of every man, to borrow the name of a well-known medieval morality play. The author is telling the story not of a particular person, but of everyone. Whew, okay. So also is the name Eve not a proper name in Hebrew. It means mother of all living. Garden of Eden also has a symbolic meaning. It means the Garden of Delights, and by extension, paradise. Living in a semi-arid climate, the ancient Hebrews pictured paradise as a green, bountiful garden filled with streams of flowing water, which would make sense why they want to locate it in Wisconsin, not the Hebrews. So, but, all right, connections to Israel's history. There are a number of suggestive parallels between the narrative flow of the J story and Israel's history. Like Adam, ancient Israel was created in a dry land through the covenant with God in the Sinai desert. Like Adam, the ancient Israel was given a green and pleasant land in which to live. In the case of Adam, a prohibition came with the covenant and the gift of land, with the threat of expulsion if the prohibition was violated. And more speculatively, the tempter is a serpent, a common symbol of Canaanite fertility religion, which was the primary temptation to infidelity to God that Israel faced in the land. Which I have said somewhere, one of the things that you want to remember when reading world religion is that one God's devil is another God's one country's devil is another country's God. Okay, so you just heard that right there. The snake was the fertility god of the Canaanites, and Israel turned it into the devil, or at least the tempter. Okay. The J story may thus have a prophetic edge to it. If Israel abandons the covenant of faithfulness to Yahweh, she faces expulsion and exile from the land garden that God has given to her. Note 24. If J is early, then the possibility of exile is a warning. If J is late, then exile has happened. And whether or not the J material is early, its integration into the P narrative occurs during or after Israel's actual experience of exile. Okay. And I just got really lost. Hang on. What note did I just read? Okay, that one. All right. So I'm reading the creation stories through a metaphorical lens. Now that we have seen some of the historical reasons why Israel told the creation stories as she did, we turn to a reading of those chapters as metaphorical narratives. A metaphorical and thus non-literal approach to these stories is not new. In the 3rd century, a Christian biblical scholar named Origen, it's Origen in case you want to look him up, commonly seen along with St. Augustine as one of the two most brilliant theologians of the early church, wrote, "What intelligent person can imagine that there was a first day, then a second and third day, evening and morning, without sun and the moon and the stars? Sun, moon, and stars are created on the 4th day. And that the first day, if it makes sense to call it such, existed even without a sky. The sky is created on the 2nd day. Who is foolish enough to believe that, like a human gardener, God planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed in it a tree of life, visible and physical, so that by biting into its fruit, one would obtain life, and that by eating from another tree, one would come to know good and evil. And when it is said that God walked in the garden in the evening and that Adam hid himself behind a tree, I cannot imagine that anyone will doubt that these details point symbolically to spiritual meanings by using a historical narrative which did not literally happen." Note 25. Origen, De Principis, 4:1 through 16. Translation is mine. Parenthetical material added. For an older English translation, see the Ante-Nicene Fathers, edited by Alexander Roberts and James Donaldson from 1979, which is a reprint of an 1885 edition, volume 4, page 36. Origen also did say that the Bible contains countless instances of a similar kind that were recorded as having occurred, but which did not literally take place. Even the Gospels themselves are filled with the same kind of narratives. Origen also strongly affirms that he sees much of the Bible as historical. Okay. The creation stories as myth. As we begin to address the question of why Israel told these stories, it is important to realize that the Genesis stories of creation are myths. That term needs careful explanation because it has been virtually ruined by its most common modern use. In popular language, myth is a dismissive term. To call something a myth is to dismiss it. One need not take it seriously. A myth is seen as a mistaken belief or falsehood. But the term means something very different in the study of religion. Myths are not explanations. Myths are not primitive science. Myths are not mistaken beliefs. Rather, myths are metaphorical narratives about the relationship between this world and the sacred. See Joseph Campbell. Myths typically speak about the beginning and ending of the world, its origin and destiny, in relation to God. Myths use non-literal language. In this sense, they do not narrate facts. But myths are necessary if we are to speak at all about the world's origin and destiny in God. We have no other language for such matters. The difference between the common dismissive use of the word myth and its meaning in the study of religion is pointed to in the title of a book written by Marcus Borg, one of the greatest scholars of religion in the 20th century, Myth and Reality. Okay, so now we have note 26. Oh, it was published in 1963. And I absolutely love Marcus Borg. His book, The Sacred and Profound, is one of my... I have a lot of favorite books. Don't ask me to list my favorite books, because then I'm going to ask you what category, and then give you my top 10 in each category. Okay? So, I do highly recommend Marcus Borg. which, by the way, let me spell it for you. Mirceeiliade. I believe he's French, but I could be wrong. And I only learned how to pronounce his name from Jesse, because up to that point, you don't want to know what I was calling him. Okay. In the modern world, myth and reality are commonly seen as opposites. We speak of myth or reality. Iliad's point is the opposite. Myth and reality go together. Myth being the language for talking about what is ultimately real. For Iliad, myths are true even though not literally true. And Joseph Campbell would agree. Okay. To cite another definition, myth is a form of poetry which transcends poetry in that it proclaims a truth. Oh, sorry. Note 27. Let's see. H.A. Frankfurt, The Intellectual Adventures of Ancient Man from 1946. The quotation continues by affirming that myth is a form of reasoning which transcends reasoning. Okay. Where was I? Okay. To echo what I said about metaphor in the previous chapter, myth is poetry plus, not science minus. In Christian thought, the Genesis stories of creation have been an exceedingly rich mine of mythological and theological meaning. They treat the great themes of God as creator, the God-world relationship, the nature of reality, human nature, and the character of human existence. As we explore these themes, we will use conceptual language to clarify the meanings of Israel's myths of the beginning. Ooh, how much longer have I got in this chapter? Ooh, I think this one may take an hour and a half. Woo. Okay. Let me grab a drink of water here. All right. God as creator. To the extent that there is a literal affirmation in ancient Israel's creation myths, it is simply this: God is the source of everything that is. One of my seminary professors said several decades ago, the only literal statement in Genesis 1 is God created the heavens and earth. Genesis speaks of creation as having happened in the beginning. In subsequent Christian thought, there are two quite different ways of understanding this statement. The first sees creation as historical origination, namely, at a particular moment in the past, at the beginning of time, God created. The second sees the notion of creation as pointing to a relation of ontological dependence. This, perhaps unfamiliar phrase, means that God is the source of everything that is in every moment of time. Okay. God is the source. And we have note 28. So let's see what note 28 says. But not of everything that happens. This distinction between everything that is and everything that happens is important. To say that God is the source of every existing entity is not to say that God is the cause of everything that happens. This applies especially to human behavior, but also to natural occurrences such as weather, earthquakes, hurricanes, and so forth. Ooh, that's a good one. Okay. All right. That is a really good one. For this view, affirming that God is creator is not primarily a statement about origination in the remote past. Rather, it is a statement about the present dependence of the universe upon God. If God ceased to vibrate the universe and us into existence, it and we would cease to exist. In traditional Christian language, God as creator is also the sustainer of everything that is. The latter way of thinking about creation seems more important. From a scientific point of view, we do not know whether there is a time when there was nothing. The contemporary Big Bang theory of the universe's origin, which speaks of a moment roughly 15 billion years ago when the present universe began, is quite compatible with the thinking of creation as historical origination. Indeed, some have seen the primordial cosmic flash of the Big Bang theory as strikingly similar to the first act of creation on the first day of the Genesis story, Let There Be Light. 20 years ago, a scientist wryly observed about the Big Bang theory. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peaks. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Which hopefully he's about to tell us who that scientist is, because it's note 29. Robert Jastrow, God and the Astronomers. I think I've seen that book. From 1980, page 105 through 106. The literature on the relationship between religion and science is vast. Among recent books that I especially recommend are Conrad Hayer's The Meaning of Creation, Genesis, and Modern Science. See note 6 above. Barbara Brown Taylor, The Luminous Web, 2000. Philip Clayton, God and the Contemporary Science, 1997. Ian G. Barbour, Religion and Science, from 1997. And since then, because this book was published, I think 2006, there have been other really good ones. I encountered a couple in ministerial school. And I'm not talking about Christian de Quincy. I think there's one that it was in my Hebrew class, called God and the Big Bang, that was really good. Okay, let's see. But it is also possible that there were universes before the present one. Indeed, it is possible that there have always been universes. Seeing the statement, God is the creator, as a claim about ontological dependence means that Christians and Christian theology can be religiously indifferent to the question of whether the universe had a beginning. To say God is creator affirms a relationship and process that continues into the present. It need not refer to a specific event at a particular time in the distant past. Which is good, because if we're going to get busy arguing about the distant past, we don't get on with living in the present. All right, this way of thinking about God as creator is compatible not only with the Big Bang theory, but also with whatever scientific theory might, and almost certainly will, replace it. Indeed, thinking about creation this way means that the affirmation of God as maker of heaven and earth is compatible with any scientific account of the universe's origin. At the level of ultimate origin, there need be no conflict between Genesis and science. The two do not directly compete. All right, the God-world relationship. Just as there are two ways of thinking about creation, so there are two models of thinking about God, about the God-world relationship. That is the relationship of God as creator to the universe. And we have note 30. For the two models, see Sally McFaig in The Body of God from 1993, and also her Models of God from 1987. Ugh. Okay. The first is known as a production model, namely that Like an artisan or an artist, God makes the universe as something separate from God's self. Once created, the universe exists separate from God, just as a house or painting exists separate from the builder or artist who produced it. This model is also associated with a particular concept of God, known as supernatural theism. This way of thinking about God conceptualizes God as another being, separate from the universe. The second way of thinking about the God-world relationship has been called a procreative or emanationist model. God brings forth the universe from God's being. Because the universe comes out of God's being, it is, in some sense, God's stuff. This model does not identify the universe with God, for God is more than the universe. Rather, it sees the universe as being of God and in God. In other words, the model is panentheistic. Note 31. This view is not to be confused with pantheism, commonly understood to mean the identification of the universe with God. The roots of panentheism is very ancient. In the Jewish and Christian traditions, the roots go back to the Bible's affirmation of both the transcendence and immanence of God. For my description of the differences between the supernatural theism, pantheism, and panentheism, see The God We Never Knew, from 1987, chapters 2 and 3. As an explicitly developed concept, panentheism is becoming more and more common among mainline Christian theologians. See, for example, Clayton, God and Contemporary Science. And in Science of Mind, it is the model we use, panentheism. Wait, let me get back over here. Where was I? To quote a passage from the New Testament, or the Christian Testament, because he said he wasn't going to call it that, and then there he does. To quote a passage from the Christian Testament, God is the one in whom we and everything live and move and have our being. That is note 32. Which is Acts 17:28. So if you ever wanted to know where that phrase was, because we use it a lot, it's in Acts. There it is. All right. The difference between these two models of thinking about the God-world relation matter. The production matter suggests that the universe is separate from God and that creation happened in some past moment. The procreative model affirms the presence of God within and beyond the universe and fits the notion that creation is an ongoing process, not simply a past event. Finally, whereas the production model and its association with supernatural theism emphasize God's separation from the world, the latter model leads to a much more intimate sense of the closeness of God to the world. Indeed, of the presence of God in the world. Obviously, the Genesis stories speak of creation using a production model. In Genesis 1, God speaks and the universe comes into being. In Genesis 2, God is like an artisan molding Adam out of earth, like a gardener planting a garden, and so forth. In short, God is portrayed as creating a universe separate from God. But because this is the language of myth and metaphor, the way we think about the creation stories need not be confined to a semi-literal reading. To cite an analogy, the Bible often speaks of God as a person-like being. This is the natural language of worship and devotion, but that does not mean we must think of God as a person-like being. In any case, whether our thoughts of creation follow a production model or procreative model, the central truth claim of the myth remains. God is the source of everything. The nature of reality. Central to Genesis 1 is the refrain repeated after each day of creation. and God saw that it was good. The pronouncement covers everything that exists. To use a Latin phrase from the medieval theology, esse qua est bonum est, or being as being is good. This does not mean that everything that happens is good, but whatever exists is good. The creation story is thus strikingly world-affirming. Indeed, the Jewish tradition as a whole has consistently been world-affirming, in spite of the horrendous sufferings that Jews have experienced. The affirmation is also central to Christian theology. Although popular Christianity, with its emphasis on the afterlife, has sometimes seen the world, especially the flesh, as highly problematic, something to keep at a distance, a place to get through on the way to one's heavenly home. But against all world-denying theologies and philosophy, Genesis affirms the world as the good creation of the good God. All that is good. Interesting. Okay. Human nature. Ancient Israel's stories of creation affirm two things about us. We are the climax of creation, created in the image of God and given dominion over the earth. Okay, I have a problem with the word dominion. I would prefer that we use the word stewardship for obvious reasons. Yet, we are also dust creatures, people made of earth. As dust creatures, we are finite and mortal. You are dust, and to dust you will return, are the final words spoken by God to Adam in paradise. Note 33. Genesis 3:19. We do not know what ancient Israel meant by affirming that we are created in the image of God. Perhaps the claim simply reflects the fact that the Genesis stories of creation are anthropocentric. That is, they are told from a human point of view and are human-centered, highlighting humans as the climax of creation. The stories are also theocentric, of course. That is, centered in God. But the divine creation they describe leads up to us. We are God's culminating act of creation. Thus, whatever created in the image of God means, it is clear that ancient Israel thought that there was something special about us. Okay, ancient Israel thought that there was something. The paradoxical juxtaposition of our special status and our smallness in relation to the universe is expressed in the familiar words of one of the creation psalms. In the first half of Psalm 8, the author addresses God and reflects on our insignificance. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Then the author affirms, yet you have made them little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet. The assessment is realistic. We are small. We are finite. We are mortal. Yet there is something different about us. Though we have learned in the last half of the century not to speak of an absolute difference between us and non-human animals, we do have a greater consciousness than any species we know. In us, the universe has become conscious of itself. In us, the universe has become conscious of itself. Okay. Although, just for a whole different perspective on that, I would suggest you read Terry Pratchett's Jingo. To the degree, the ending of that book will blow your mind. To the degree that, and yes, it is fiction. To the degree that ancient Israel did not dream of, we have become dominant with very mixed consequences for the earth and ourselves. Note 34. Some historians of culture have argued that the modern domination and destruction of nature has its roots in the Bible as the sacred text of Western culture, especially the creation story with its affirmation of God-given human dominion in Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. The indictment has some substance. The dominion text was often cited to legitimate the Western development of the world, but it is probably not fair to the text itself. Walter Brueggemann comments that the dominance referred to in Genesis 1:28 is that of a shepherd who cares for, tends, and feeds the animals, and notes that it pertains to securing the well-being of every other creature and bringing the promise of each to full fruition. From his book, Genesis, page 32. And that right there is the argument why I prefer the word stewardship over dominion. When you translate it as dominion, I would argue that it does lead to the destruction that you see that we are constantly doing. Like, we are running species out of it into extinction, and yet stewardship is the shepherd, where we manage our resources. Okay. I need to finish this up because this chapter is just going on and on. Okay. Let's see. Yet we are creatures of dust, fated to return to dust. Moreover, according to Genesis, we are not simply mortal, but fallen. Okay, we got about 5 pages left, because I'm running out of air here. The character of human existence. The term, the fall, does not occur in the Genesis story of creation. As a description of the events surrounding Adam and Eve's expulsion from paradise, it is largely a Christian label. Jews typically do not speak of the fall. Within the Christian tradition, the fall has commonly been understood to mean the fall into sin. It has also been associated with the notion of original sin, which is not simply the first sin, but a sinfulness that is transmitted to every individual in every generation. This latter notion, which goes far beyond what the Bible says, is usually attributed to the brilliant but troubled theologian Augustine around 400 CE. So, as we hear and read this story again, we shall try to free ourselves of specifically Christian associations of the fall. Though the term the fall does not occur in the story itself, the story of Adam and Eve's accepting the temptation offered by the snake points to something having gone wrong. The consequences are vivid, evocative, and thorough. Adam and Eve find themselves living east of Eden in a world that must endure toil and sweat for one's bread and pain and suffering in childbirth. They are banished from paradise forever. The rest of the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis describe the deepening consequences. In the next generation, murder. Adam and Eve's son Cain kills his brother Abel. The violence deepens until even the boundaries of the cosmos are violated. The sons of God are mating with the daughters of men, with monstrous consequences. things are so out of control that God sends a flood to destroy all life except those on Noah's Ark, so that creation can be renewed. But soon thereafter, the cycle begins again with the story of the Tower of Babel. Humans try to build a tower that reaches into the heavens, but God overturns their effort, and humankind is fragmented into its babel of different languages. Clearly, the Hebrew storyteller is saying that something has gone wrong. Life began in paradise, but is now lived outside of the garden, in an exile of hard labor, suffering, pain, violence, and fragmentation. Though the world is beautiful, something is not right. We do live in a world of suffering and pain. But what went wrong? What action, desire, or deed led to such pervasive consequences? The language of the storyteller is evocative, not precise. It does not clearly point to a particular reading. Thus, over the centuries, a variety of understandings of what went wrong have emerged. Each leads to a somewhat different understanding of sin, that primal act that plunged human beings into a world of suffering, and each expresses nuances of what went wrong. And he's about to label them all out. Okay, so the primal act of disobedience. The first understanding is the simplest, though not necessarily the most perceptive. The act responsible for Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden was disobedience. God gave them a command. They disobeyed it, and that was that. The emphasis is on the disobedience itself, not on what the act of disobedience was. For this view, in its most elementary form, it would have made no difference if God's prohibition had been, please don't eat the daisies. This view typically leads us to seeing sin in general as a matter of disobedience. God gives us commands and rules and laws, and we break them. The human problem is disobeying God, the lawgiver. Ooh. All right. The primal act as hubris. A second understanding agrees that disobedience was involved, but emphasizes what the act of disobedience involved. In particular, it focuses on the first half of the serpent's temptation. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. The desire is to become God-like, to tower above who we are, to be the center of creation. In the Christian theological tradition, this is known as hubris, a Greek word commonly translated as pride. But in this context, it means more than the everyday meaning of the word pride, as in the sentence, I was proud of myself when I did that. Hubris means exceeding one's proper limits. It means giving to oneself the place that belongs to God alone. It means making one's self the center. Hubris can take many forms, ranging from a world-conquering arrogance to a self-preoccupied malaise. What these forms have in common is a life centered in the self and its concerns. Sin, the human problem, is thus hubris understood as self-centeredness. I know a lot of politicians that applies to. All right. Pride as, the primal act. I'm good for about an hour. This is, we have gone beyond my limits now. The primal act as sloth. The third understanding is almost the opposite of the pride discussed above. The word sloth does not mean laziness in this context. Rather, it means leaving it to the snake, letting someone else author one's existence. It means uncritically accepting somebody else's ideas about how to live one's life. In this view, sin, the human problem, is heteronomy, living the agendas of others. And that brings us to note 35, which is the second to the last note. Yay! I owe this understanding to the title and content of Harvey Cox's On Not Leaving It to the Snake from 1967. Paul Tillich, one of the two most important Protestant theologians of the 20th century, makes the same point when he speaks of heteronomy, as one of three ways of living one's life. Heteronomy means living in accord with the agenda of others, people, culture, the nation, and so forth. Autonomy means living one's life, living with oneself as the center, and is thus hubris. Theonomy means living with God as one's center. It is the desirable state of affairs, and that from which we have fallen into either heteronomy or autonomy. Wow. Okay. Very interesting. Interesting. All right. Now we're going to get to, I think this is the last one. The primal act as the birth of consciousness. I think Jesse leans into this one, but he'll tell us on Monday. Or next Monday. Giovanni's a cat. Okay, so the primal act as the birth of consciousness. The fourth understanding also focuses on what the primal act was, but it emphasizes the second half of the serpent's temptation. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. Knowing good and evil is understood broadly to mean having knowledge of opposites, a capability that is intrinsic to the birth of consciousness. Consciousness involves distinguishing one thing from another. Above all, it involves the self-world distinction, the awareness that the world is other than oneself. The birth of consciousness is something we all experience. All of us become aware of the self-world distinction very early in life. Thus, we cannot avoid the primal act. Indeed, this understanding emphasizes not the disobedience and the sinfulness of the fall, but its inevitability. All of us begin life in the womb with an experiential sense of undifferentiated unity. We begin in paradise. But the very process of growing up and the birth of consciousness that is intrinsic to it propels us into a world of division, anxiety, and suffering. Living east of Eden is intrinsic to the experience of being human. We all go through the fall and live in a state of exile and estrangement. It cannot be avoided. And that is our last note, so let's see what note 36 is. From an exposition of this understanding within the framework of Jungian psychology, see Edward F. Edinger, Ego and Archetype, 1973, 16 through 36. And we are down to the last page and a half. I'm going to make it. These various understandings can also be combined. For example, the birth of consciousness typically leads to hubris, understood as being centered in oneself. However, centering in oneself intensifies the sense of separation from the world, deepening the experience of exile. The process of socialization leads to sloth, understood as heteronomy. We internalize and live in accord with the agendas of others, including parents, cultures, and religion. As already mentioned, it is impossible to say that the Hebrew storyteller intended one of these more than the other, or intended any or all of these. But the creation stories are an example, par excellence, of a religious classic. They are stories that have a surplus of meanings. They are stories that have a surplus of meanings. Moreover, whatever the storyteller's sense of what went wrong, in paradise, the story's picture of the consequences are persuasive and compelling. Most of us, most of the time, live east of Eden. What this means is vividly portrayed in the painting The Expulsion of Adam and Eve by the 15th century Italian artist Masaccio. Masaccio. I don't speak Italian. Therefore, I just mastered that name. As the first couple is driven out of Eden, Adam's head is down, both hands covering his eyes. Eve's face is upturned, but her mouth is open in a howl of pain, her features full of grief and sorrow. At least some of the time, life outside of Eden is like that. The creation stories and post-critical naivety. Given the richness of meaning that a historical-metaphorical reading of Genesis reveals, the creation stories strike me as profoundly true. Critical thinking leads to an understanding of why the details of Genesis are as they are, and also makes clear that their truth is not to be understood in literal, factual terms. Rather, their truth is expressed in the non-conceptual language of myth and metaphor, and no particular reading can exhaust their meanings. But I can hear the truth of their central claims. This, the universe, and we are not self-caused, but grounded in the sacred. This is utterly remarkable and wondrous, a mystery beyond words that evokes wonder, awe, and praise. We begin our lives in paradise, but we all experience expulsion into a world of exile, anxiety, self-preoccupation, bondage, and conflict. And yes, also a world of goodness and beauty. It is the creation of God, but it is a world in which something is awry. The rest of the Bible is to a large extent the story and stories of this state of affairs, the human predicament and its solution. Our lives east of Eden are marked by exile, and we need to return and reconnect. By bondage, we need liberation. By blindness and deafness, and we need to see and hear again. By fragmentation, and we need wholeness. By violence and conflict, and we need to learn justice and peace. By self and other-centeredness, and we need to center in God. Such are the central claims of of Israel's stories of human beginnings. And that's what I'm talking about. He truly loves the Bible. And you can see it in his readings. Whew. And I'm done. That was a long chapter. That took a lot longer than I was expecting. That took almost 2 hours. So I'm going to wrap this up in case David has been trying to get on for the last 40 minutes. That was chapter 4